And just note, because I did enable a waiting room, I may have to manage participants as they come in and let them join. So hopefully we won't be disturbed too much. But for those of you on today, we're going to be spending probably about an hour, maybe a little less, just highlighting some key things that leaders would need to know in regards to supporting an MTSS within their buildings. And so really the goal for today is that we establish some common language. We focus on the leadership components of MTSS, and we're going to focus on three main components. Of one is developing effective teams, supporting implementation by creating and communicating a vision, and then also providing resources. And so I see several folks on the call. There's a lot of knowledge already on the call today, so some of this may be review for you, but I encourage you to take this information and if you're not a school leader yourself, to share this with the school leaders that you work with as well. And so that I can share the presentation and the resources following today's presentation. So I will do that. Again, we'll probably go for about an hour, maybe a little bit less, and then we have some time at the end of the session today to review any questions or answer any questions that you might have. And if I can't answer them today, I will definitely follow up. All right, and so just to review, most of you are familiar. We do have 6 critical components when we're talking about MTSS. And so we have leadership, building capacity and infrastructure for implementation, communication and collaboration, database problem solving, 3-tiered instruction intervention, and data evaluation. So really it's important that you would focus on all 6 of those critical components to have a sustainable MTSS implementation. But today we're going to spend our time talking about that first component of leadership. So for those of you who've been with us for a while, you don't often see triangles in our presentation, but I think it's one of those, and thinking about helping school administrators understand the layers of instructional support, it's nice to have this vision of, we really start with that differentiated core, which is that bottom level. And when we think about differentiated core, that's what we're providing for all students. And so all students have access and are receiving that core instruction. And it could be differentiated based on their need, but that all students are receiving that. And then as you move up the levels of support, you'll see supplemental support, which is really intended to be for some students, small groups of students who may need to receive additional intervention to support their needs. And then lastly, that third tier, or that third level of support, is intensive support or individualized support. And that's really providing support and doing individual problem solving to support a student's need at that intensive level. And so really what I find in the work that I do is that often when we think of MTS, we think of this visual of the 3-tiered model. But if we remember back to what we saw in the previous slide, that this is just one of the 6 components for a sustainable MTSS. And so one other thing to note that we throw these numbers out a lot is that you would really want to see about 80% of your students who are responding to your differentiated core. So that means that 80% of your students should be meeting your expectations or be at proficiency for a grade level. And then when we move into supplemental support, we're really looking at about maybe 15% of your student body, and then intensive support around 5%. And so when you look at your data, if that's not the case, say only 60% of your students are proficient with just core, that you may think about what do you do to support core, because most likely it's not possible for you to intervene your way to proficiency. You just won't, most folks don't have the capacity or support to provide supplemental and intensive support to 40% of their students. And for some of you on the call, I know you've seen this before and we have this conversation, but I think when we start thinking about where we've been in the state of North Carolina in regards to MTSS, we started way back when with response to intervention, or RTI. And so in that framework or that approach, we really were looking at identifying some students that were at risk who need more to help them be proficient. Others would say that RTI was the way that we identify kids for special education. But really how we see MTSS in the state is that it's really a framework for total school improvement. And so that part of an MTSS is identifying students at risk and providing them support as needed, but it's also looking at the larger structures and systems that are in place to improve what's going on in your buildings every day. And so that includes all students and it includes all staff. And so MTSS is not just for some kids and some staff members, but it really includes the entire building and the folks that are in it. So that was kind of a brief overview of MTSS. And now we're going to really hone in on leadership and what school leaders can do to support the implementation of an MTSS. And so we're really going to focus on three main areas today: providing support, the importance of leadership teams, and then developing and communicating the vision. And so I think here, we're going to talk about communicating your vision first as it relates to MTSS. And really, and we've done a lot of work around this, so if you've been with us for a while, you've heard about your compelling why, and really being able to build the compelling why as to why, because often when we're talking about MTSS, we're potentially talking about shifts in practices and beliefs for folks. And so having that compelling why to come back to is really important. And it helps folks push through or persevere through change, which is hard for us as adults, to really do what's in the best interest of students. So developing that compelling why, and then also developing a personal vision. So if you're the leader of your school, what's your personal vision for your school, for the building that you run? And then how do you communicate that vision out to your staff, to your students, to your families, to your community? And so doing this work early on is really important. And we'll watch a video here in a second that kind of explains a little bit more as to why. But some of the things for me, when I think about my compelling why and the work that I do, the compelling why for me is really that I think that all students should have access to a high quality public education. And that's honestly one of their civil rights in the United States, is that they should have that. And so for me, MTSS is the way to provide that high quality public education. And that my personal vision is that our public schools provide experiences that promote equitable outcomes and opportunities for all students. And again, for me, that's my vision. And I honestly believe that an MTSS is the way to achieve that vision. And so as school administrators start to think about what is their compelling why that they believe in and can speak to it with passion, and that will help lead folks down that path of change and working through what does an MTSS look like. And so before we move on, I just want to share, and this will be in the documents that I send out after along with the slides is just, we have a brief little, a brief document about helping you think through what is your compelling why, thinking about developing your vision. And so you can kind of brainstorm here, what are some thoughts, what compels you to support an MTSS and continue to do the challenging work that comes with it. And then you can kind of put your compelling why there, as well as your vision. You can start to think about what is the why of your vision, what is the how, and what is the what of your vision. And it's kind of just like a graphic organizer to help you think through developing your vision. And then from there, how am I going to communicate that vision to my stakeholders? And so how am I going to really drive them to buy in and to take part in MTSS or what I'm selling? And so I will share that document with you at the end of today. Now let's see if I can easily get the PowerPoint back. There we go. Okay. So we're going to just now watch a brief video. I'm sure some of you have seen this before, but I think it really does a great job of explaining why spending time on developing your compelling why and your vision and how to communicate that is important.
Psychologists know that there are two systems in our brains, the rational system and the emotional system. Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist at NYU, came up with a great analogy for these two systems. He said, think of your brain as a human rider atop an elephant. The rider represents the rational system. That's the part of us that plans and problem solves. The rider might do some analyzing and decide, hey, I want to go that way. But it's the elephant, representing the emotional system, that provides the power for the journey. The rider can try to lead the elephant or drag the elephant, but if these two ever disagree, who would you bet on? The elephant has a 6-ton weight advantage, and it's exactly that power imbalance that makes adopting new behaviors very hard. If you want this duo to head a new direction, you also need to think about the path, which represents the external environment. This duo is more likely to complete a journey if you can shorten the distance and remove any obstacles in their way. So bottom line, if you want to lead change, you've got to do 3 things. Give direction to the rider, knowledge of how to get to the destination. You've got to motivate the elephant, which means tapping into emotion. And finally, you need to shape the path to allow for easy progress. That's how change happens.
So with that in mind, it's one of my favorite videos, and I think about it a lot when I think about leading change and inspiring people, is that idea of thinking about your leadership style. And so thinking about the rider and those rational systems, how are you showing folks the plan or the vision? Here's how we're going to get there. Clearing any barriers or things that may keep folks from following that plan. But I think for me, one of the most important things is, how do you tap into that emotional system and really get folks to follow the plan? And I think, for me, I really enjoy building a plan and having my spreadsheets and my checklist and things that are all very rational. But I think we've all experienced times where, but we just don't feel like it, or there's part of our kind of emotional system that kicks in that will maybe keep us from following that rational plan. And so how do you continue to to tap into that emotional system as well. And I think for me, the answer to that is having your compelling why and having it touch folks in that way and inspire them, as well as your vision. All right. So that was kind of that first component of developing and communicating the vision. And so then from there, we are going to talk about the importance of leadership teams. And so what we're going to talk about here, and so I clipped this off of a document that we had shared in previous sessions, but really when you start thinking about teaming, it's really important. I think in our buildings we have plenty of teams, but thinking about having a team or a leadership team that is guiding MTSS implementation. And so we've kind of highlighted, based on those 6 critical components, here are some things that leadership team would have like responsibilities to take care of in regards to MTSS implementation. And so for leadership, it's really about communicating the vision and mission, resource planning, and implementing instruction and intervention, and ensuring staff have the data they need. So that's really kind of the focus in regards to leadership. And then for building capacity and infrastructure for implementation, it's about providing ongoing professional development and coaching. It's about looking at the schedule and scheduling accordingly, and processes and procedures for engaging in database problem solving. So that would be the responsibility of the leadership team there. And then for communication and collaboration, it's really ensuring consensus and feedback, involving stakeholders, building infrastructure to communicate and work with families and other community partners. And then for database problem solving, the leadership team would really utilize database problem solving for student outcomes across content areas, grade levels, tiers, and also use problem solving to address barriers in regards to school-wide implementation. And an example for that for me is the other day, I was just presenting last night and to some students at UNC who are grad students who work in schools now, and one of them said, well, you know, what I hear when we're having our tier 2, our supplemental problem solving meetings, that teachers will say, well, I'm doing this, I just don't have the documentation for it. And so my response, and so then it kind of slows it down. And then teachers have to go back potentially and redo what they've been doing. And so for me, I said, well, then I think what you would do is apply the problem solving model to the barrier. So if the barrier is teachers are having difficulty documenting what they're doing, that you problem solve that and a solution to that to remove that barrier, so teachers can come to meetings prepared with their data and share what they've been doing to support students. And then the leadership team, in regards to the 3-tiered instructional model, the team would examine, define, and facilitate both academic, social, emotional, and behavioral instruction and intervention. And so not necessarily that the team is the one doing that, but they're defining it, ensuring that it's there and teachers and staff have access to it. And then lastly, the responsibility of the leadership team for data eval is supporting school staff to understand and have access to data sources, procedures, and protocols for data collection and educational decisions, and data on fidelity of MTSS implementation. And so if you think these are the responsibilities of a leadership team, and it's not necessarily to do it all, but it's, so if I look at data eval and that staff understand data sources, maybe your leadership team doesn't necessarily have that person. I think of maybe your MTSS leadership team doesn't include your literacy coach, but your literacy coach might be the person who's providing the professional development and coaching on how to use their literacy universal screening data. And so the leadership team would just ensure that training and coaching is happening. And so for admin, what you would want to do is look at this list of responsibilities and say, do we have teams in our buildings already doing some of this? Or do we need this additional leadership team to look at these responsibilities or to address these responsibilities? And so I think it's just a good way to think about what is the purpose of an MTSS leadership team. Do we have folks who are already doing this in our buildings? The idea is not to have two teams doing the same thing or overlapping, but how do we have our teams be efficient and effective? And then just one other piece to highlight is the importance of having a leadership team. And I really think looking at those responsibilities that were up there, it's really about leading implementation of MTSS. And so what this visual is showing here is just the importance of having that team. Because what we see is that when there's no implementation team, that you could expect 14% implementation with fidelity within 17 years. Yet, if you have an implementation team, that you could expect 80% implementation with fidelity within 3 years. And so it's really, if you, like, I think of it as if you don't have a team guiding, monitoring, problem solving barriers, it's really just you provide a PD and then you cross your fingers that you'll see about 14% of folks doing that with fidelity within 17 years. Versus if you have a team who plans, who guides, who problem solves, who assists in that implementation, that you're going to quickly have implementation with fidelity amongst more staff members. And so if you think of that in the sense of having that team and doing that work, think of all of those people under, like all the blue people, as students. And so that's just the ability to impact more students in an efficient and effective way versus not having an implementation team. And so thinking about how important having that implementation leadership team is, if you don't have one currently, what you might want to start thinking about is who might be on that team. And you know, for us, thinking about leaders in your building who maybe have some of that leadership responsibilities already. So having coaches, potentially a school psychologist, definitely a school administrator should be leading that leadership team. If you have someone who is leading MTSS in your building, whether that's an MTSS coach or, you know, someone who is a classroom teacher but does, you know, has an interest in MTSS and they're leading that work, having them on the team. But I think also having representation from, you know, teachers. And so it could be each grade level, or you could say K through 2 has a representative and 3 through 5 has a representative, as well as, you know, special ed has a representative, or if you have ESL teachers, but that you're having folks who are interested in the work, can provide information to think about planning and problem solving around barriers as well. And so think about who is on your team, but as well, like, how do you make it happen? So do you have meetings monthly? How do you meet? When do you meet? Different things like that. And as much as that sounds pretty basic, I think planning out and setting up your meeting schedule ahead of time is really important, because our schedules fill up really quickly as soon as the school year starts. So. And then just thinking about, I wanted to take a second to share really the structure that we currently have in the state around teaming, because it's not just we have these school leadership teams, but you'll see in the middle there that we do have, the state has a MTSS team, and we're currently the Integrated Academic and Behavior Systems Division. But that we have a state team, and our direct contact with districts or school folks is the district MTSS team. And so the schools that we work with, or the districts that we work with, often have a point person, and that's normally our point of contact, whether that's an MTSS coordinator or someone who has MTSS as a responsibility in their job description, we typically have a point of contact, and they will come receive information, PD, coaching, and then take that back to their team. Often we ask that some additional members will come to our meetings, our regional meetings, besides just a MTSS coordinator, so that more team members are coming and receiving that information. And so then from there, the district MTS team is then kind of the middleman for providing then information to school leadership teams within their district, but then also sharing with district leaders, potentially superintendent or assistant superintendents, or if you have a cabinet, board members, that there's also lines of communication to other district leaders, so they're informed about what needs to happen or what's going on with MTSS implementation as well. And so then when we think about the district team, what is really their responsibility to school teams? Because they're really, in our vision of MTSS at the state level, we see district folks being the ones who provide support and coaching and PD to our school leadership teams. And so one would be that they provide a feedback link regarding district leadership policy. And so they're informing school leadership teams what the expectation is in regards to MTSS implementation. But additionally, they help to guide school leadership teams to implement through PD, technical assistance, and coaching. And so that's really how the teaming structure that we see from that larger level outside of schools. All right. So that touches on kind of that second piece of the importance of leadership teams. And not just, we didn't talk about the rest of the teaming structure. There are more teams within an MTSS, especially individual problem solving teams, or you could have supplemental teams that look at supplemental support. But really, we just focused on really the importance of having that leadership team and some of the roles and responsibilities there. So then the last component that we're going to touch on today is providing support and the components that fall under that as a leader. And so really, when we think about support, what we're talking about is providing resources for implementation, as well as professional development and coaching. And so the first piece that we're going to talk about here is resource allocation. And so we're going to take just a second to look and reflect on this this not definition, but this quote right here. And so resources for implementation is really a stock or supply of money, materials, staff, and other assets that can be drawn on by a person or organization in order to function effectively. And so really what you want to think about is, what does this mean to our school? And what does that mean specifically to our school in regards to MTSS implementation? And so when I think of resources, of course, we've highlighted that could be professional development, that could be coaching, that could be money, funding for different things. It could be materials or programs that you're purchasing. It could be personnel that you're providing. But I think also one of the things that I think about is time, and having that resource of time as well, and being able to supply that as well. And so as a school administrator, you want to think about these things of how are you allocating your resources, all of those different things to support MTSS implementation. And then within an MTSS, the 3 levels of support we talk about can also be thought of in terms of resource allocation. And so how have we distributed the resources we have across core, supplemental, and intensive? And is our distribution in line with the needs of our site? For example, we have set the effectiveness benchmark for core at 80%. So if we're below that benchmark for what we, for 80% proficiency responding to core, how do we change the allocation of our resources? And do we need to put more resources or more, and resources don't necessarily mean money, but it could be more time. Do we need to add more time in the day that we're spending on core? Or do we need to have additional coaching provided to, maybe it's a certain grade level or subject, or but thinking about that in regards to resources. And really, I mean, if you think about also the allocation of resources within this tiered system, is core is what we do for all kids. And so when you think about that, the large majority, if we're thinking about funding and personnel, should go to core. And then you're seeing less in regards to supplemental and intensive, just because there are fewer students who are receiving that. Not to say that the quality is diminished. You should have high quality intensive support, but we shouldn't have the large majority of our funding going to intensive resources. All right. And so as I talked about also this idea of time as a resource as well. And so research tells us there are some basic non-negotiables that we can adhere to when we think about building a school master schedule. And so your master schedule can be your greatest asset for implementation, but it can also be your greatest barrier. And so we're just going to look at these non-negotiables that have been presented and think about, what does that mean if you're a school leader? What might that mean for you in scheduling within your building? And so number one right there, research tells us that schedules should reduce fragmentation of the school day for teachers and students. And so I think of that in the sense of, if your expectation is that core instruction should be 90 minutes, that potentially it's not 60 minutes here and then another 15 and another 15, but that potentially if there's a way to provide those 90 minutes in one chunk of time, that would be preferable. And so not maybe having specials within that block or something like that. And then 2 is capitalize on time as a variable that can impact student achievement. 3, harness the power of teams to support school improvement. 4, adequate time for tier 1 or core instruction based on data. 5, adequate time for intervention, enrichment, or remediation during the school day. And then 6, to maximize resources. And so just think about, as you're thinking about that, what does that mean for you? We're going to dig in a little bit more around adequate time for core instruction. But really thinking about time in your school days, from the time students get off the bus, from the time that they get back on, that we're leveraging our ability to use time as a resource at our schools. And we can use the master schedule as this, resource, and thinking about, how do we get the most bang for our buck? How do we reduce fragmentation in a variety of different things? How do we cut out maybe some of the things that are taking time that aren't beneficial or aren't providing anything extra to support our students? So first, when you think about, that number 4 and supporting cores, is scheduling core first. So like I said, what you would want to start with is examining all student data from the spring or summer before, and to start building your schedule for next year. And, maybe pausing, maybe having a tentative kindergarten schedule, but then really looking at your fall data to solidify that schedule for kindergarten. And so really then what you want to look at is what percentage of students are entering the next grade on target to meet standards. And what percentage of students need to make more than a year's growth in a year. And so if there's a larger percentage needing more than a year's growth, that indicates that you may need to schedule more time and resources in core instruction. And so I think it's important if you get those blocks of core on your schedule first, and then try to fit in the additional pieces within the schedule, but really putting core on your schedule first. So that's really talking about resource allocation and what leaders need to be thinking about in regards to resources for implementation. So then we're going to just take a little bit and talk about professional development and coaching as support for MTSS as well. And so if MTSS is school improvement, then we really want to think about how does professional development align. So if we're thinking about school improvement, that we want to make sure that what we're doing in our buildings aligns to an MTSS. And so we want to think about not only the PD we provide, but also how do we use coaching to support this work, and that all professional development opportunities and coaching efforts should be aligned within an MTSS framework. And so for me, how I would approach that is that I would look at my facilitated assessment of MTSS, or the FAMS, to guide PD. And so it highlights there what are some of the things that are needed to support MTSS implementation. So I think about database problem solving. And so here you might think, school improvement, we don't even know where to start with school improvement because we're not good at problem solving. So maybe one of your school improvement goals is around selecting a problem solving model, and then from there being able to provide the professional development and coaching to utilize that problem solving model with fidelity. And that aligns to an MTSS framework or model. I also think of within the FAMS, we talk about assessments and having access to data that lets us know whether MTSS is effective or if core is effective. And so that may mean that you're providing, say you have a new assessment tool, making sure that you have professional development and coaching so that all folks know how to administer the assessment, how to interpret that data, and how to communicate that with families, but then also what to do with it. So what is the data telling me to make a plan for how to improve in the future? And so that we're really thinking about PD. And I even think about aligning that PD and being very explicit about if you've adopted a new core curriculum or a new literacy curriculum, that is aligned to an MTSS and supporting core instruction. And so making sure that what you're doing to improve within your school aligns within an MTSS. And so we're going to consider some essential questions about a differentiated core instruction. And so as I ask these questions, to think of them through the lens of leadership and think about the role that leaders have to define core instruction. And so for instruction, what practices are we expecting all educators to use? And how have we trained and coached them on these? And so I think that's important to think about. Instruction is really defining what do we expect to see, and then how have we trained folks? And I think this is really important to ask that question, not just once, but every year. Because I think in my experience, what I've seen is that you may be lucky to be in a district for initial rollout of a curriculum, yet the teacher who comes in 2 years from now doesn't necessarily get the same training and coaching. And so thinking about if we expect this, how do we make sure that all folks in our buildings have been trained and coached on it? And the same with curriculum. So what materials and programs are we expecting all educators to use? And how have we trained and coached them on these? And then when it comes to environment, that we would think about how do we want our environment structured across classrooms? So including expectations, routines, procedures, climate. So how do we want that environment structured? And then how have we trained and coached folks on these? And so I think about that with like the core behavior training we have and the adult routines that we talk about. So how do we make sure that everyone has had access to that training and coaching? And then lastly, thinking about the data sources and assessment. So what do we expect all folks to administer? How do we expect them to score it? Or if, you know, if it's a computer-based platform that the computer's probably scoring, but if there's anything that's given by hand. But also too, I think there's some importance in making sure that we're scoring is reliable and that, you know, teachers are pretty much consistently scoring things if there's some objectivity to that and there's consistency in that. And then that takes, I mean, so to be able to do that also takes professional development and coaching as well. And then I think the same thing, so that was really focused on core instruction, but then we can ask similar questions when we start thinking about the skills that our staff need in regards to supplemental and intensive support. And so with instruction, we would ask, what practices are we expecting educators to use with intervention? And how have we trained and coached on these? Or what materials and programs are we expecting to be used with intervention? And so here, I think about our standard treatment protocol. And so if you've defined your standard treatment protocol and you've defined it through the lens of ICE, that you could then say, have we, you know, we've defined it, how have we trained and coached folks in meeting these expectations? But I think step one here for me is really ensuring that you have a standard treatment protocol where you've outlined what the supplemental and intensive supports curriculum is in instruction, as well as data. How are we going to monitor this, progress monitor, and when do we expect you to do those assessments and different things like that? And so this is just a handy tool. So we've shared something similar in regards to just outlining your core in general. And so, you know, typically instead of professional development, coaching, and planning, you've seen literacy, math, behavior, and then you would outline, or you would put in those boxes, what would you expect, or what is expected for instruction in literacy, curriculum literacy. And so we've kind of taken that same template and switched it up a little bit to say, so if we're talking about fourth grade literacy, we're still saying, what is the instruction we plan to see? That, you know, you've probably already developed when you've defined your core. But now that you're then saying, how are we going to provide professional development? How are we going to provide coaching and mentoring? And that you may say, you know, fourth grade receives literacy coaching once a month or something like that. And so you would outline that. And then what's the plan for new staff? So if we do this in this initial rollout, then how are we going to onboard new staff as they come on? And I will find this document and share it with you in the resources and follow up. So then just to end with just the takeaways for today, and what I shared is really that we're ensuring common language. And so as we start to, as an administrator, we start to set out what is our common language, and that's really starting from the 6 critical components and making sure everyone is on board with that and understanding what an MTSS is and what it involves, that we've created and communicated a vision, that leaders develop effective teams and support those effective teams. And not only do they develop them, that they're part of those teams as well. I think that's critical, that school leaders are active participants on that MTSS leadership team. That leaders provide resources for planning, they share tools to assist the leadership team, and they facilitate opportunities for planning and networking to support an MTSS. And so lastly, most of you are familiar, but I just wanted to end with a lot of resources that we have that school leaders maybe are less familiar with than our MTSS coordinators at a district level, but there are a lot of resources, tools, informational sheets, and guides on the live binder. And so that's the link there to head to the live binder to access some of those. And with that, that is what I have for today, but I do want to open it up to questions. I have the chat box open, so I want to open it up if anyone has questions. That feel free to enter those in the chat box, and we'll give a few minutes for that. All right, well, I'm going to give you guys just a few minutes to think about that, type some questions in if you have them. All right, so we have one from Amy. So when we ask schools to describe what practices we are expecting them to see for literacy, for example, are we asking about strategies they're using to teach phonics, or is it more about implementing guided reading? And so I think, Amy, for me, it's probably both. I would think that the strategies that they're using would probably go under kind of those instructional practices, and then potentially that the curriculum that you're identifying would be guided reading 3 times a week. And so I think it would be both, but maybe the strategies would fall more in those instructional practices, and then guided reading or Letterland or something like that, actual like named thing, would be the curriculum that you would identify. Good question. And then I think too, as you think about this, because I know several of the folks that were on are district coordinators, but I will share these with you, and so feel free to take this information. There are some notes in the slides, and so that you could use whatever you find valuable in this PowerPoint to share with your school leaders as well. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'm going to stop recording. So I just want to thank you all for your time today.